What's going on, guys? This is the Red Rogue, and I hope you're all doing well today. Now that we're a few weeks into patch 9.1 and there's no signs of major class or spec tuning coming, it's time to go over some rogue-specific information. More precisely, we'll be looking into Outlaw Rogue for today's episode. These videos do take a bit of time to make, so don't worry, I will be doing one for Assassination and Subtlety as well for any of you non-pirate types out there. It just takes a little time to make them. As always, this video will be segmented out so you can jump to whatever information you're looking for, as I'll be covering a variety of topics including Covenants, Legendaries, Talents, Gear, and the new Shards of Domination system. And also, as always, a big wall of disclaimer text for this guide. Please take into consideration that your own character's gear, Covenant choice, Legendary choice, Talent choice, and all that stuff can and will directly impact what is considered the best option for you. Always sim your character using a site like raid bots, because unless your character is exactly identical to mine or anyone else's or even the ones used by the simulation craft simulations, you can and possibly will have some different results in what works best for you and your playstyle. Some options are unanimously better than others though, and some are really close together. I'll do my best to point out certain things that I highly recommend though. First, a quick recap of the noteworthy changes that Outlaw Rogues have seen in patch 9.1. Surprisingly, on the PvE side of things, Outlaw has not seen much of any changes at all. Mainly, it was a couple bug fixes for the Guile Charm Deep Insight buff lasting longer than intended, and Shiv is now able to benefit from the energy procs of Combat Potency and can generate an extra combo point when the Broadside Roll the Bones buff is active. In general for rogues, there were a couple good quality of life changes for some of our utilitarian moves. The damage reduction effect of Feint has now increased to 6 seconds up from 5, and Shiv now always removes all enrages on a target, regardless of whether you're using Numbing Poison or Crippling Poison for your non-lethal. Due to this, using Shiv while Numbing Poison is active now causes the target's casting speed to be reduced by 25% for 5 seconds. And now, on to the probably most volatile and debatable topic of this entire guide, Covenant choice in patch 9.1. The bright side is that most of the Covenants for Outlaw are very competitive, sitting within like 2 to maybe 3% of overall damage of each other. The three main Covenants vying for the attention of Outlaw at the moment are Kyrian, Necrolord, and Venthyr, with each having its own strengths and weaknesses, and of course very different Covenant abilities. That being said, I would still recommend playing the Covenant you find yourself enjoying the most, as the difference between them is so small that player skill and user error will be a more apparent gain and loss of damage than a mere 1 or 2%. Sadly, the Night Fae are noticeably a little lower than all the other Covenants, sitting about 2 to 3% away from the rest. Again, if you're a really awesome Night Fae Outlaw Rogue and you just really like how it plays, you'll still hold up perfectly fine. But that gap does start to become a bit more apparent in patch 9.1 regarding Covenant balance. For each of these sections, I'll be putting a little chart at the top of the screen and then explain how and why each Covenant falls into their place. For the top single target Covenant, we'll be seeing the Kyrian Soulbind Forgelight Prime Mechanicos as the prime choice. Following up very closely is Nagia the Mistblade of the Venthyr, with Bonesmith Airmere of the Necrolords coming in a bit lower and tying with General Draven of the Venthyr. Again, these are all exceptionally close by only like 100, 150-ish DPS in ideally perfect situations, meaning you don't need to completely hop to a different Covenant over like 50 DPS. Seriously, it's not that big of a deal. Naya of the Night Fae is your top single target soulbind if you choose to serve the Winter Queen, though she is a bit lagging behind in comparison to the others. With the damage output being so close between the top 3 soulbinds, it's really hard to say cut and dry what is the best single target choice. Realistically, it's a dead tie between Kyrian and Venthyr if you play perfectly, with Necrolord coming in right behind and Night Fae a little further behind than that. Next, we'll go over multi-target and cleave situations. The Necrolords across all 3 soulbinds will pull ahead due to the sheer muscle of Serrated Bone Spike and the synergy it has with Outlaw's Blade Flurry ability spreading the damage across up to 4 additional targets. So really, you can run any of the 3 soulbinds pretty confidently. A mini is a tiny bit ahead if you can get a lot of extra primary stat buffs from lead by example if you're standing near other people when you use Bone Spike, and if you're good about sniping low health adds for free Bone Spike charges, then that means you can have even higher lead by example uptime. For a bit more predictable and consistent damage gains though, and not having to worry about buffing allies by standing near them when you Bone Spike, then Bonesmith Airmere is just a great all-around choice anyhow. All of the damage gains from Bonesmith Airmere's Soulbind tree are very passive, so you don't have to worry about doing really anything out of the ordinary to get free damage out of her. Coming in pretty close behind the 3 Necrolords for AoE and Cleave is once again Forgelight Prime Mechanicos of the Kyrian, with Clea performing a bit worse and Pelagos lagging behind both of them. Mechanicos' new Soulbind trait, Effusive Anima Accelerator, works very well with multiple targets, as the more enemies you hit with your Echoing Reprimand slash, the shorter the cooldown of your next Echoing Reprimand, potentially dropping it down to a mere 30 seconds. The Venthyr in general are all really close together in performance, so really, running any of the 3 for AoE or Cleave is fine, as there's only about 100 or so DPS separating all of them. As far as the Nightfare holding up, the strongest choice is Khura'in. First Strike is still a really potent Soulbind trait, as that big crit chance proc whenever new adds show up is really good. Unfortunately though, they're still overall the lowest performing Covenant in this regard, especially if you aren't using Khura'in and instead are using Dreamweaver or Naya. Alright, now that we've discussed Covenants, let's take a peek at our Conduit choices. Unsurprisingly, regardless of which Covenant you pick, Count the Odds is the one super important Conduit that you must wear in virtually all content. Seriously, it's not even close. The free Roll the Bones buffs are awesome, so always make sure to attack with either Dispatch or Ambush when you stealth or use Vanish. Outside of this virtually mandatory conduit, your second best option will vary based on your Covenant and what item level conduits you have, so be sure to sim your available options. If you're a Venthyr, your second best choice will be Lashing Scars, the Flagellation conduit. Otherwise, you'll want to be using Sleight of Hand for even more free buff chances when you reroll. For a third potency slot, Sudden Fractures of the Necrolords and the Kyrian conduit Reverberation are both pretty good, depending on Covenant preference, of course. Otherwise, Triple Threat for your standard Outlaw conduits will be your last choice. An important aspect of Outlaw Rogue is knowing what talents are worth using, as some require a bit of more effort than passive alternatives. While these might be the best talents in most situations, if you don't like how they play or don't use them to the fullest, then you might find that you do better or enjoy a different option more, so please keep that in mind. Primarily, this section is to strongly recommend that you give Ghostly Strike a chance. While this was considered a bit of a meme talent for a while, it is actually quite a bit stronger in single target than Quick Draw, and just gives a nice flat damage gain on whatever target you slap upside the head with it. Something important to keep in mind if you're new to Ghostly Strike. The damage debuff it applies only affects your primary target since it's a debuff, which means it does not increase the amount of damage you spread via Blade Flurry, just as an FYI. This section isn't to say that Quick Draw is a terrible talent, but if you get really good about having high uptime on your Ghostly Strikes, you will notice a solid DPS gain in priority target damage. For Mythic Plusers out there, this is also a nice way to increase your damage on the Tormented adds and bosses or just anything that needs to die more. So even in keys, I would recommend giving it a try and seeing how you like it. Quick Draw is still very widely used since it's much easier to play with. So if you really hate Ghostly Strike for whatever reason, then don't feel pigeonholed into having to run it, but I'd give it a try just to see what you think. In the big debate on the next row of Deeper Stratagem versus Marked for Death, you can kinda really run whichever you prefer. I find Marked for Death to be a smidge better personally, since it lets me improve cooldown reduction via True Bearing and Restless Blades more easily, even in single target. Just make sure you always use it at 1 combo point or less if possible. However, do keep in mind if there is ever a fight or basically any situation where you can use Marked for Death on low health enemies to snipe them for those free and quick resets of the cooldown, then this will become noticeably stronger than Deeper Stratagem. Deeper Strat is still a perfectly fine choice, but really just using Marked for Death on cooldown is competitive and often better than it even in single target, so I would try both out. Blade Rush and Killing Spree are both pretty competitive talents. However, you might find Blade Rush is a little bit better on single target and in really large trash pulls in Mythic Plus since it isn't target capped. Blade Rush also offers a bit of utility since you can use it like a charging lunge attack to reach a faraway enemy, so that way you get a little bit of extra use out of it. That, and it's a far safer option than Killing Spree if you're not used to running it, because for the unprepared, Killing Spree is a very dangerous talent to use. Killing Spree will do more damage in the 2 to 5 target range in most cases though, but again, timing this move can be a bit hazardous. In some situations, Killing Spree can actually outperform Blade Rush in single target as well, so if you plan on using it for that, then make sure you are very low on energy so you don't overcap during the 2 seconds of the Killing Spree animation. Oh, and don't get hit by some random one-shot mechanic too, even if it means holding the cooldown for a little bit. Dead DPS does no DPS after all. Next, let's look over our legendary choices as Outlaw. And if you need any extra info on how to craft legendaries or how to upgrade your legendaries to the new rank 5 and 6 stuff introduced in patch 9.1, then I'll link one of my newer videos covering the process up in the corner of the screen now. Please keep in mind that some of these legendary choices can and are affected by the talents you're running, and I'll do my best to mention them in those situations. As I mentioned earlier, Ghostly Strike is something you should really consider trying out if you haven't yet, because it can make some of these legendaries perform better than other ones. I also won't be doing every single legendary in this list just because a lot of them are really close in performance and some are just bad, so I'll just be pointing out some of the viable options of varying playstyles and needs. Currently, the tried and true and boring and reliable Celerity is the best all-around choice for virtually all PvE content. This gives a flat 8% damage buff whenever Adrenaline Rush is active, and gives a chance for mini Adrenaline Rush procs as long as you have Slice and Dice active, which should be literally all the time. This power comes from Ventinax in the Spires of Ascension dungeon if you don't have it already. While a kinda boring legendary since it's just a damage amp on a cooldown that you always use and you get random procs, it is really effective in single target and AoE, and in dungeons it also buffs the damage of all the Tormented Affix procs, which is a nice bonus. For dungeon usage and depending on your gear, Mantle of the Master Assassin is still a pretty viable option. Really though, you would need to be basically avoiding gear that gives critical strike rating for this to be the case, which is pretty hard since a lot of the gear in dungeons and the Sanctum of Domination have crit on it. So, as always, be sure to sim yourself with the Dungeon Slice method on raid bots if you still want to run this legendary power. The guaranteed crit windows from Master Assassin are very tempting with the amount of burst damage it offers, and being able to re-stealth between trash pulls means you can get a lot of use out of it. If you need to collect this legendary power still, you'll be looking at the Affront of Challengers encounter in the Theater of Pain dungeon. For any Kyrian rogues out there, Resounding Clarity is quite decent in both single target and AoE since it benefits from running Mechanicos once you hit Renown 57, as that will unlock his new capstone trait, Effusive Anima Accelerator. This legendary makes it so Echoing Reprimand always anima charges combo points 2, 3, 4, and 5, so you can get even more hard-hitting finishers out. Running Mechanicos as your soulbind with his Effusive Anima Accelerator will allow you to shave off 3 seconds of the cooldown of Echoing Reprimand for each enemy you hit with the initial AoE burst of Echoing Reprimand, up to a total of 15-second cooldown reduction. In practice, it can be better than Celerity for AoE by just a little bit, so take that into consideration if you want to give this legendary a try. Your Covenant-specific legendary power is unlocked at Renown level 48 if you haven't gotten it yet, as a heads up. For Necrolords, Deathspike has some very strong potential if you're interested in trash damage in dungeons, though it has a couple of quirks to it as of me putting this video together, and knowing how Blizzard works, they'll fix it right in the middle of me editing the video and putting it up on YouTube since that happened with Serrated Bone Spike already. Anyways, Deathspike makes you shoot out an extra Bone Spike at a random nearby target, and you get 2 additional charges of Bone Spike as well so you can bone even more people. Yeah. There are a couple problems with this legendary right now, but if these get fixed, then you might be seeing a lot more usage of this legendary, and even with it being kind of wonky right now, it still does pretty great for what it's useful for. The annoying issue with Deathspike right now is that the additional Bone Spikes that shoot out don't give charges if a target dies with the bleed active. Now, some people have been debating if that's how it's supposed to work or not, but I'm pretty sure on the PTR, all charges gave Bone Spike charges, and the additional hits did too. But the real issue with this is if you're in a low target cleave situation and you're using Bone Spike and tabbing between targets, when you hit a target with a Bone Spike, if the other target gets hit with an additional Bone Spike, then it'll overwrite the bleed that you originally put on it, meaning when that target dies, even if you directly hit it with Bone Spike, it won't give you a free charge of Bone Spike back, even though that's one that you've already hit directly. So you end up actually losing out on free charges due to this issue. Do keep in mind that Deathspike offers basically little to no gains in pure single target, so you would really only want to put this for improved AoE damage if you have the chance to get a lot of resets of Bone Spikes for trash pulls in Mythic Plus, or on certain boss encounters with really frequent ad spawns like Gore Chop in Theater of Pain, or Amarth in Necrotic Wake. If you want a bit of a different playstyle that's a more generic outlaw choice, then Greenskin's Wickers is still a pretty viable option if you're running the Quick Draw talent specifically, otherwise it's not really worth using. If you really just hate Ghostly Strikes and you prefer the BFA and Legion style of playstyle from like the Deadshot Azerite traits or the old Greenskin Legendary and Legion, then you might want to give this legendary a try. However, if you don't have it already, then you'll need to pug a Sledge Fist kill in Castle Nathria or queue for some LFR, as he is the source for the pistol shot focused legendary. And remember, always use between the eyes with at least 5 combo points, even if it would cause you to overcap to make sure you get to it. Otherwise, you run the risk of not proccing the legendary effect, which would suck a lot. While there isn't really a best in slot list anymore with how many ways you can gear out in Shadowlands, there are a few very potent trinkets and weapons worth mentioning if this is your first foray into Outlaw Rogue. Most notably, the Sanctum of Domination raid has quite a number of very strong weapons and trinkets that you'll want to keep an eye out for. Ideally, you really want to get your hands on a Cruciform Vein Ripper fist weapon. This comes from the 6th boss of the raid, Painsmith Rasnal, and be prepared for an endless tirade of jokes about balls if your guild has the maturity level of a 5-year-old. This is basically just a weapon with a really frequent proccing bleed damage effect. You'll need to either be behind your target, the target will need to have a slowing or movement impairment effect on them, or a loss of control effect like a stun or CC for the bleed to have a chance to trigger. In raid usage, this basically means being glued to the butt cheek of whatever enemy you're fighting if possible. For dungeons, this means crippling poison and pistol shot procs will be your best friend, as both count as movement impairments. Definitely a fantastic fist weapon to get. And ideally, this will be your main hand weapon if you can get a reasonably high item level version of it, as the next weapon I'll be talking about should be used for your offhand once the RNG Lords have blessed you. But if not, you can easily wear the Cruciform Vein Ripper as an offhand if you have a higher item level weapon for your main hand instead. Heck, you can even wear 2 Vein Rippers if you want, though the bleed procs can and will overwrite each other, so you won't be getting like double the effect out of it. It's really like the second one is only 50% effective, so it's not quite as big of a DPS gain as you might think it would be. The Edge of Night Dagger off of Sylvanas Windrunner is another huge DPS gain due to the proccing Banshee's Blight effect it has, which makes your finishing moves have a 3% chance per combo point spent to proc a hit of shadow damage. This weapon has a pseudo-execute style effect, where your target will get more stacks of Banshee's Blight based on how low health they are. With more stacks of Banshee's Blight, the shadow damage proc increases in power, so the effect becomes more valuable the further into the fight you are. This is a pretty exceptional weapon that any Outlaw Rogue will want to get at least one of, and is basically the best possible offhand weapon you can hope to get. Even at lower item levels, this is still a pretty big source of free damage, though it is quite a bit of a pain to get, seeing as Sylvanas is the last boss in the Sanctum of Domination raid. And an honorable mention, though this weapon is not quite as desirable as it once was, is Poxstorm, the Longsword of Pestilence. This sword comes from the Plaguefall dungeon, and at one point was basically the best possible weapon you can get as Outlaw since it was the only weapon that had a proc effect on it. It's still really good, and being that it's from a Mythic Plus dungeon, you can farm it a bit easier and upgrade it all the way to 246, so definitely something to consider and keep an eye out for. For trinkets, there are a couple really noteworthy ones that will be highly desirable. Again, always sim your available options, since sometimes a high level but okay trinket will still outperform a low item level but desirable one. Mainly, you'll want to be looking for a salvaged fusion amplifier, which comes from the Guardian of the First One's raid boss. This trinket is quite strong for rogues in general, and for Outlaw this is especially true. For Mythic Plus farming, the Phial of Putrefaction is once again the most desirable dungeon trinket you could hope to get from the Box of Sadness. Sorry folks, get back into Plaguefall and keep farming, as this thing is still as good as Mythic Raid trinkets. An honorable mention, however, is going out to the Ticking Sack of Terror. This is a trinket from the new mega dungeon Tazavesh, off the Maelroom Mayhem encounter. Despite being quite a bit lower in item level since it isn't in the Mythic Plus rotation yet, this trinket is extremely potent and a very desirable option that you should keep in mind. Running Tazavesh on hard mode gives you a chance for a 233 version up from the regular 226 that would come from it, so that does help a little bit. But honestly, once Tazavesh is put into the Mythic Plus rotation, in its current state at least, this trinket will most likely outperform even the coveted Phial of Putrefaction. And while this is still kinda part of the Noteworthy Gear section, I felt it was important to go over the Shards of Domination system for patch 9.1 in its own section. Basically, these are really convoluted and annoying replacements for class tier sets from prior expansions, except way more generic and complicated and can be like a 14 to 17% DPS gain. Honestly, going into every aspect of the Shards of Domination system is a bit out of the scope of this video, so if you need a full explanation of how all of it works, I'd recommend checking out my video I did specifically that goes over it. Yes, it's really that complicated for whatever reason, so yeah. For Outlaw, you'll want to get your hands on the Frost set of Domination Shards, which includes Core, Kier, and Tell. Wearing all 3 of these shards in your Domination gear, including a pair of Domination shoulders, will give you the Winds of Winter effect while you're in the Maw, Torghast, Korthia, or the Sanctum of Domination. This set effect stores a portion of our critical hits, and every 20 seconds it'll deal damage based on the stored amount, as well as give us an extra absorb shield for the damage that was dealt by the winds. This is not only a lot of free damage, but also some extra survivability, which is always a big plus. The Unholy Chaos Bane set is really good, as it gives a lot of free agility and some extra damage procs, but you'll really want to max out your Frost Shards if you already have all 3 of them and a pair of Domination Shoulders already, as the shoulders are mandatory for the set proc to work. Oh, and a super big thing to remember is that your set's bonus effect is based off of your lowest rank shard in the set, so always upgrade them evenly, as the set bonuses become massively better with each rank it goes up. Outside of the zones where the Domination set bonuses are active, you'll still want to use the individual Domination shards, as several of them are noticeable DPS gains. Primarily, I would recommend the Shard of Core for Mythic Plus out of any of them, as having an extra damage increase on basically every trash pull from attacking a new enemy is pretty big. The Shard of Beck is another pretty good option and kinda works like a pseudo execute, because you need to have a percentage of health of 50% or more than your target. So if you're at 100% health and your target's at 50, then it will activate. But if you were at 75% health, then the target would need to be at 25% health, because that's still that 50% gap. So you can't count on it being active all the time if you're taking damage, especially if there's any AoE going on, but it kinda works like execute damage, so it's definitely a plus. The Shard of D's is another good one, as it's free damage just from hitting the same target over and over, and between our auto attacks and using moves every GCD, it's basically up all the time, which is pretty useful. Outside of that, the Shard of Kier is pretty amazing, because it gives you a flat absorb shield, and in the dungeons that I've used it in, this thing can make up almost a quarter of my overall healing just from the absorb shield. Again, this all of course depends on if you have the Domination gear with the sockets, or if you even have the shards in the first place yet, so I would recommend making sure, if possible, to kill Sylvanas Windrunner at least once a week, because she gives a guaranteed shard that you're missing. So if you can do normal, great, or heroic, even better, or even if you just wait until the LFR wings come out for her, you can do that every week and you'll eventually have your full shard set by killing one boss, which is pretty handy. Anyways, folks, I hope this video helps get a little bit more up-to-date information on the changes in patch 9.1 regarding covenants, soulbinds, talents, and all the other stuff that was in this video. If you have any questions about anything in this video or anything else really about Outlaw or really whatever, feel free to ask me in a comment below, or you can swing by my community Discord to ask or just to chat. The link for that will be in the description of this video. If this video did prove useful to you, then please consider leaving a like or a comment to show your support, as they're both monumentally helpful with the way the YouTube algorithm does all of its inexplicable magic. And as always, my appreciation and gratitude to all of my viewers and especially my patrons, who all help make these Shiba Shenanigans possible. Thank you all so much for watching. This is the Red Rogue, and I'll see you guys around.